The West Virginia Bloodbath. The miner who slaughtered 10 men over a stolen pickaxe. The cold November rain hammered against the tin roofs of the mining camp like thousands of tiny hammers, each drop echoing the rhythm of pickaxes that had fallen silent for the night. In the heart of McDowell County, West Virginia, where the coal seams ran deep and the mountains stood like silent sentinels over the lives of men who carved their existence from stone and darkness, the year 1952 was drawing to a close with the same brutal indifference it had shown since January. Jacob "Jake" Thornton sat on the edge of his narrow cot in the cramped quarters he shared with 5 other miners, his calloused hands trembling as he stared at the empty corner where his pickaxe should have been. The tool wasn't just a piece of equipment, it had been his father's, passed down when the old man's lungs finally gave out from 30 years of breathing coal dust. The wooden handle was worn smooth by 2 generations of Thornton hands, and Jake had carved his initials beside his father's near the base. That pickaxe had fed his family, put shoes on his 3 children's feet, and kept the landlord from evicting them from their company-owned shack on the hillside. Now, it was gone. If you're watching this story unfold, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're from. We'd love to hear from viewers all around the world. Now let's continue with what happened next in this devastating tale. Jake's wife, Mary, had noticed the change in him immediately when he came home that evening. His jaw was set in that particular way that meant trouble was brewing beneath the surface. She'd seen that look before. The night his brother was killed in a shaft collapse when the company refused to shore up the supports properly. The morning they found out the company store had raised prices again while wages stayed frozen. But this was different. This was personal in a way that went beyond economics and safety violations. "Someone took it right from my station," Jake had told her, his voice low and dangerous. "Right from my goddamn station while I was helping shore up Tunnel 7. I set it down for 20 minutes and when I came back, it was gone." Mary had tried to reason with him, suggest he report it to the foreman, maybe borrow one until they could save up for a replacement. But Jake wasn't hearing any of it. In his mind, someone had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. In a place where a man's tools were his livelihood and his honor, theft wasn't just a crime, it was a declaration of war. The mining camp of Blackridge sat in a hollow between 2 mountains, accessible only by a winding dirt road that turned to mud soup whenever it rained. 300 men worked the Consolidated Coal Company's mine there, most of them immigrants or sons of immigrants, Italians, Poles, Irish, and mountain people, whose families had been in these hills since before West Virginia split from Virginia during the Civil War. They lived in identical wooden houses, painted the same dull gray, shopped at the same company store where prices were always just high enough to keep everyone in perpetual debt, and drank at Murphy's Tavern on Friday nights when they got paid in company script that was only good in Blackridge. Jake had arrived at the mine the next morning before dawn, as he always did. The November air was sharp enough to cut, and his breath formed clouds that dissipated into the darkness. Other miners trudged past him toward the mouth of the mine, their lunch pails clanking, their boots crunching on the frozen mud. Most nodded to him in greeting. Jake was well liked, known as a hard worker who didn't complain and helped newer miners learn the ropes. He'd been working these tunnels for 15 years since he was 17 years old. But that morning, Jake wasn't thinking about work. His eyes scanned every man who passed, looking for any sign of his pickaxe. He'd spent half the night lying awake, running through possibilities in his mind. Who had been in that section of the mine? Who would have had the opportunity? The more he thought about it, the more a name kept surfacing in his consciousness like a body rising from deep water. Vincent Corelli. Corelli was a relatively new arrival to Blackridge, having come from Pennsylvania about 8 months earlier after getting blacklisted from the mines there for organizing work stoppages. He was a big man, barrel-chested with arms like tree trunks and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same coal they pulled from the earth. He had a reputation for being handy with his fists and wasn't shy about throwing his weight around. Some of the men respected him for standing up to the bosses. Others thought he was trouble looking for a place to happen. Jake and Corelli had never been friends. They'd had words a few weeks back when Corelli tried to take credit for shoring up a dangerous section that Jake had actually secured. It wasn't a huge conflict, just the kind of friction that happened when men worked in tight spaces under dangerous conditions. But Jake remembered the look in Corelli's eyes, a kind of cold assessment, like he was measuring Jake and finding him wanting. The morning shift began with the usual routine. The miners gathered at the entrance where the foreman, a company man named Russell Hewitt, read out the day's assignments. Jake was assigned to Tunnel 9, deep in the mine's eastern section. It was good work, a productive seam, but it meant he'd be down there for hours without seeing daylight. As the men filed into the cage that would drop them hundreds of feet into the earth, Jake spotted Corelli near the back of the group. The big Italian had a new pickaxe slung over his shoulder. Jake's blood ran cold. He pushed through the crowd of miners, ignoring their protests as he made his way to Corelli. When he got close enough, he could see the tool clearly. The handle was worn smooth, and near the base, barely visible in the dim light, were the carved initials, JT, and beneath them, older and deeper, E.T. Edward Thornton, Jake's father. "That's my pickaxe," Jake said, his voice cutting through the noise of men and machinery. The conversation around them died instantly. In mining camps, disputes were common, but they were usually settled quickly and quietly. Everyone knew that tensions underground could get men killed. The crowd of miners formed a circle around Jake and Corelli, their faces illuminated by the carbide lamps on their helmets, casting strange dancing shadows on the rock walls. Corelli looked down at Jake. He had at least 4 inches and 50 pounds on him, and smiled without warmth. "You're mistaken, Thornton. This is mine. Bought it from old Pete McAllister when he retired last month." "That's a lie," Jake said flatly. "Pete McAllister never owned that pickaxe. That belonged to my father. And before I came to work here, I carved my initials right next to his. JT and ET. Let's see the base of that handle." Something flickered in Corelli's eyes. Anger, maybe, or calculation. "I don't have to show you nothing. Now get out of my way before I move you myself." The foreman, Russell Hewitt, pushed his way into the circle. "What's going on here? We got work to do." Jake pointed at the pickaxe. "That's my tool. It was stolen from my station yesterday, and now Corelli's got it. He's trying to claim he bought it from Pete McAllister, but that's impossible, because it's been in my family for 30 years. Hewitt looked uncomfortable. The last thing he wanted was trouble that might slow down production. "Corelli, let's see the handle." "Like hell," Corelli said. "I don't answer to you about my personal property. If Thornton's got a problem, he can take it up with the sheriff in town." "The sheriff who's on the company payroll?" Jake's voice was rising now, the anger he'd been containing starting to boil over. "The same sheriff who looks the other way every time the company shorts our pay or poisons our water." "That sheriff," Hewitt held up his hands. "Now, Jake, let's not—" "Show me the handle," Jake interrupted. "If those initials aren't there, I'll apologize right here in front of everyone. But if they are, you're going to explain how you came by my father's pickaxe." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The other miners watched silently, knowing that whatever happened next would ripple through the entire camp. In these mountains, a man's word was everything. If Corelli was proven to be a thief, he'd be finished. No one would work with him, no one would trust him, and he'd eventually have to leave. But if Jake was wrong, if he was making false accusations, he'd be the one damaged in the community's eyes. Corelli's face darkened. For a long moment he stood there, the pickaxe still resting on his shoulder, his jaw working as he ground his teeth together. Then, with a sudden violent motion, he swung the pickaxe off his shoulder and held it up, gripping it with both hands like a weapon. "You want to see the handle so bad?" Corelli's voice was low and dangerous. "Come and take it." The miners around them shifted nervously. This was about to cross a line from which there was no return. Underground, in the narrow confines of the mine entrance, there was no room to run, no space to avoid what was coming. Jake knew that if he backed down now, he'd never be able to hold his head up again. But if he pushed forward, violence was inevitable. Jake stepped closer. "I'm not afraid of you, Corelli. That pickaxe belonged to my father, and I want it back." What happened next happened fast. Corelli swung the pickaxe in a horizontal arc, not trying to hit Jake, but trying to drive him back, to assert dominance. Jake ducked under the swing and came up inside Corelli's reach, throwing a punch that caught the bigger man on the jaw. It was a solid hit, thrown with all the strength that came from 15 years of swinging a pickaxe in tight spaces, and it rocked Corelli's head back. The fight should have ended there. In a normal world, the other miners would have pulled them apart. Hewitt would have sent them both home, maybe docked their pay for a few days. But this wasn't a normal world. This was Black Ridge in 1952, where every man lived on the edge of survival, where small slights could fester into blood feuds, where the pressure of working underground in constant danger needed release like steam from a boiler. Corelli roared and charged at Jake, the pickaxe forgotten as he tried to tackle the smaller man. They crashed into the rock wall, and the sound of impact echoed through the entrance. Other miners scattered to give them room, and within seconds the fight had attracted everyone's attention. Men came running from deeper in the mine, from the equipment sheds, from the office shack. The crowd grew to 50, then 75, then more. Jake fought with everything he had. He was outweighed and outreached, but he was faster, and he fought with the desperate fury of a man defending not just his property, but his family's honor. He landed punches to Corelli's ribs, his face, anywhere he could reach. But Corelli was incredibly strong, and eventually he got his hands on Jake and threw him to the ground. The fall knocked the wind out of Jake's lungs. He gasped for air as Corelli stood over him, fists clenched, blood running from his nose and mouth. The bigger man's face was twisted with rage, all pretense of civilization stripped away. He drew back his boot to kick Jake in the ribs. That's when Tommy Brennan intervened. Tommy was Jake's friend, had been since they were boys growing up in these mountains together. He grabbed Corelli's arm and tried to pull him back. "That's enough." "He's down!" Corelli spun and hit Tommy with a backhand that sent him sprawling. Two of Tommy's cousins immediately jumped into the fray, and suddenly it wasn't just Jake and Corelli anymore. It was a full-scale brawl involving a dozen men, then 24, split along lines of loyalty and old grudges that had nothing to do with the stolen pickaxe. Hewitt blew his whistle frantically, trying to restore order, but no one was listening. The fight spilled out of the mine entrance and into the muddy yard outside. Men grappled and punched, slipped in the mud, grabbed tools and lunch pails to use as weapons. It was chaos, pure and simple, the kind of explosion that happened when too much pressure built up with nowhere to go. In the midst of the brawl, Jake had managed to get back to his feet. He saw the pickaxe lying on the ground where Corelli had dropped it. He dove for it, his fingers closing around the familiar worn handle. When he lifted it, he saw the initials carved into the wood, JT and ET, just as he'd said. Proof. Vindication. But vindication didn't matter anymore. The situation had spiraled far beyond a simple theft. Jake looked around at the fighting men, at the blood and mud and rage, and something inside him shifted. This wasn't about the pickaxe anymore. This was about respect, about dignity, about all the small humiliations and injustices that accumulated in a place like Black Ridge until they needed an outlet. Jake saw Corelli across the yard, grappling with Tommy Brennan. The bigger man had Tommy in a headlock and was squeezing, Tommy's face turning red. Something primal and terrible rose up in Jake's chest. He gripped the pickaxe and started forward. "Jake, no!" Mary's voice cut through the chaos. She had come down from their house, drawn by the commotion, and now she stood at the edge of the brawl with a look of horror on her face. "Jake, it's not worth it." But Jake couldn't hear her. Or maybe he heard her and didn't care. He was beyond reason now, beyond consequences. He raised the pickaxe as he closed the distance to Corelli and Tommy. What happened in the next 10 seconds would change everything. What happened would turn a simple dispute over a stolen tool into a legend whispered about in mining camps across Appalachia for generations. What happened would earn this day a place in the bloody history of the West Virginia coalfields. Jake swung the pickaxe with all his strength. The pointed steel head caught Corelli in the side of the neck, just above the collarbone. The big Italian's eyes went wide with shock. Blood sprayed in an arc across the mud. Tommy Brennan scrambled away, his face spattered with red, his mouth open in a scream that was lost in the noise of the ongoing fight. Corelli dropped to his knees, his hands going to his neck, trying to stem the flow of blood. But Jake didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Something had broken loose inside him, some dam that had been holding back years of frustration and anger and desperation. He swung again and again, and the other men started to realize what was happening. The fighting stopped. Men froze in mid-punch, mid-grapple, their attention drawn to the horror unfolding in their midst. Vincent Corelli's body collapsed face first into the mud, and Jake Thornton stood over him, the pickaxe gripped in both hands, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. For a moment, there was absolute silence except for the sound of rain on tin roofs and Jake's ragged breathing. Then Russell Hewitt found his voice. Jesus Christ, Jake, what have you done?" Jake looked down at the pickaxe in his hands, his father's pickaxe, and saw that the steel head was stained red. He looked at Corelli's motionless body. He looked at the circle of miners surrounding him, their faces pale with shock, and he knew with absolute clarity that his life as he'd known it was over. "He stole from me," Jake said, his voice hollow. "He stole from me, and nobody was going to do anything about it." Tommy Brennan got to his feet, wiping blood from his face. "Jake, we need to get you out of here. When the sheriff comes—" "Let him come," Jake said. "I'm not running." But even as he said it, he could see the looks being exchanged among the miners. Some were sympathetic. They understood the code that had been violated, understood that in a place like this, you couldn't let a man steal from you and get away with it. But others were horrified, seeing not justice but murder, seeing a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. Hewitt had backed away and was running toward the office shack, presumably to call the authorities. The other miners began to disperse, some helping wounded friends, others just wanting to get away from the scene. Within minutes, only a handful remained. Tommy and his cousins, a few of Jake's closest friends, and Mary, who had come forward and now stood a few feet away from her husband, tears streaming down her face. "Jake," she whispered, "what have you done? What's going to happen to the children?" The children. Sarah was 9, Thomas was 7, and little Margaret was only 4. They'd been sleeping when Jake left for work that morning. They had no idea that their father had just become a killer, that their lives were about to be torn apart. Jake dropped the pickaxe and went to his wife. He pulled her close, ignoring the blood on his clothes that was now staining hers. "I'm sorry," he said into her hair. "Mary, I'm so sorry. But I couldn't let him. I couldn't just—" "I know," she said, even though she didn't, even though nothing about this made sense. "I know." The sheriff arrived within an hour along with 2 deputies. Sheriff William Clayton was a hard man in his 50s, a former miner himself who'd gotten the job through political connections with the coal company. He took one look at the scene. Corelli's body being covered with a tarp, the blood-stained mud, Jake Thornton sitting on a crate with his wife beside him, and shook his head. "Jake Thornton, you're under arrest for the murder of Vincent Corelli," Clayton said, pulling out handcuffs. "You have the right to— well, hell, you know your rights." Jake didn't resist. He let them cuff him, let them lead him to the sheriff's car. As they drove away, he looked back at Mary standing in the rain, and at the mine entrance where he'd worked for 15 years, and at the mountains that had been his whole world. He wondered if he'd ever see any of them again. News of the killing spread through Blackridge like wildfire. By noon, everyone in the camp knew the story, and by evening, it had reached the other mining towns in McDowell County. The reaction was mixed. Some people thought Jake had been justified. Corelli had stolen from him, had challenged him, had forced the confrontation. In the rough justice of mining camps, that was sometimes enough, but others saw it differently. Vincent Corelli, for all his faults, had a wife too. Rosa Corelli had moved to Blackridge with her husband, pregnant with their first child. When she heard what had happened, she collapsed. The baby came early, born dead 2 days later. The tragedy compounded the tragedy, and suddenly what had seemed like a straightforward case of defending one's honor became something much more complicated. Jake spent that first night in the county jail in Welch, the county seat. The cell was cold and damp, with stone walls that seemed to press in on him. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the moment the pickaxe hit Corelli's neck, saw the spray of blood, saw the big man's eyes go wide with shock and pain. He'd killed men before during the war in France fighting the Germans, but that had been different. That had been combat. Us versus them, kill or be killed. This was something else entirely. A lawyer named Daniel Foster came to see him the next morning. Foster was a young man, earnest and idealistic, who'd come to West Virginia to help miners fight the coal companies in court. He'd won a few cases, lost more, but he kept trying. Now he sat across from Jake in the visiting room, and laid out the situation. "You're going to be charged with first-degree murder," Foster said. "The prosecutor is talking about the death penalty. You killed a man in front of 75 witnesses in broad daylight. There's no question you did it. The only question is why and whether a jury will see it as justified." "He stole from me," Jake said for what felt like the 100th time. "He stole my father's pickaxe, and when I confronted him, he came at me." "I believe you," Foster said, "but proving it is going to be difficult. The pickaxe is evidence now, and yes, it has your initials carved in it. But Corelli's friends are already saying he bought it legitimately, that you attacked him unprovoked. It's going to be your word against theirs." Jake leaned back in his chair. "What chance do I have?" Foster was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, not good. The coal company wants this to go away quickly and quietly. They don't want miners thinking they can settle disputes with violence. They're going to push for a fast trial and a harsh sentence. And the prosecutor, William Dodson, he's ambitious. This is a high-profile case. If he can get a conviction, maybe even an execution, it'll make his career." "So I'm finished," Jake said. "Not necessarily," Foster replied. "If we can show that you were defending yourself, that Corelli attacked you first, we might be able to get it reduced to manslaughter. That's still serious time, but it's not the death penalty. And if we can demonstrate that the theft of your pickaxe was part of a pattern of harassment or intimidation by Corelli, we might get some jury sympathy." Jake thought about Mary and the children. How would they survive without him? The company would evict them from their house within weeks. Mary would have to find work, maybe as a laundress or cleaning houses. The children would have to drop out of school to help support the family. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd tried to build, would crumble. "Do what you can," Jake said finally. "But I'm not going to lie. I killed him. That's the truth. I killed him because he stole from me and I lost control." Foster nodded slowly. "Honesty is good, but we need to frame that honesty in a way that makes the jury understand why you did what you did. We need to make them see that in that moment, you weren't a murderer. You were a desperate man pushed beyond his limits." The trial was set for January, giving Foster about 6 weeks to prepare. In that time, he interviewed dozens of witnesses, trying to build a picture of what had happened and why. What he discovered was more complicated than he'd expected. Vincent Corelli, it turned out, had a history of violence. In Pennsylvania, before coming to West Virginia, he'd been involved in several fights that had sent men to the hospital. One man had nearly died from head injuries after Corelli beat him with a wrench, but Corelli had never been prosecuted because the coal company there had covered it up. They valued his work and didn't want to lose a productive miner. When Corelli came to Blackridge, he'd brought that same aggressive nature with him. Several miners came forward, reluctantly, afraid of being labeled snitches, to say that Corelli had bullied them, stolen their equipment, taken credit for their work. But no one had stood up to him because he was big and mean and had a reputation for not forgetting slights. Foster also learned something else. Jake Thornton was widely respected. Miners talked about how he'd helped train newcomers, how he'd shared his lunch when someone forgot theirs, how he'd once risked his life to rescue a man trapped in a cave-in. He was a good man, they said, a family man. What he'd done to Corelli was out of character, but they understood it. The problem was getting any of this into court. Foster knew that the prosecutor would object to character evidence, would argue that it didn't matter if Jake was a good man or if Corelli was a bad one. Murder was murder, and the law had to be upheld. Mary visited Jake every day that the jail allowed. She brought him food from home, letters from the children, news from Blackridge. The camp had split into factions, those who supported Jake and those who thought he'd gone too far. Tommy Brennan and his cousins were organizing support, collecting money for Foster's legal fees and for Mary and the children. But Rosa Corelli's friends were equally vocal, demanding justice for Vincent, demanding that Jake pay the ultimate price. "There's talk of violence," Mary told Jake during one visit. "Some of Corelli's friends from Pennsylvania have come down. They're saying they'll handle things themselves if the court doesn't." Jake's blood ran cold. "You need to take the children and leave. Go stay with your sister in Charleston until this is over." "I'm not leaving you," Mary said firmly. "We're a family. We stay together." "Mary, if something happens to you or the kids because of me—" "Nothing's going to happen," she insisted. But her eyes told a different story. She was afraid, and that fear was justified. As January approached, the temperature dropped and snow began to fall on Blackridge. The mine continued to operate. It always operated, no matter what personal dramas unfolded in the lives of the miners. But there was a tension in the air that everyone could feel. The trial was going to be a flashpoint, and everyone knew it. The night before the trial began, Foster came to see Jake one last time. "I have to be honest with you," the lawyer said. "The prosecution has a strong case. They have eyewitnesses who will testify that you struck first, that Corelli was defending himself when you hit him with the pickaxe. They're going to paint you as a violent man who committed a brutal murder in cold blood." "What about our witnesses?" Jake asked. "The men who'll testify about Corelli stealing the pickaxe, about his history of violence?" "We'll present them," Foster said. "But the judge may not allow all of it, and even if he does, I don't know if it'll be enough. The jury is going to be made up of local people, and half of them probably work for the coal company in some capacity. They're going to feel pressure to convict, to show that the rule of law applies even to sympathetic defendants." Jake nodded slowly. He'd expected as much. "How long do you think I'll get? If we're lucky, 20 years, with possibility of parole after 10. If we're not lucky." Foster didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. That night, Jake lay on his bunk and thought about his life. He thought about growing up in these mountains, about learning to mine coal from his father, about meeting Mary at a church social when they were both 16. He thought about the birth of each of his children, about the pride he'd felt when Sarah learned to read, when Thomas caught his first fish, when Margaret said her first word. He thought about all the small moments that made up a life, the Sunday dinners, the Christmas mornings, the summer evenings sitting on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. And he thought about the moment he'd swung that pickaxe, the split second when everything changed, when he crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Had it been worth it? Had defending his honor and his father's memory been worth everything he was about to lose? He didn't have an answer. He just knew that in that moment, facing Corelli's mocking face and the jeers of the other miners, he'd felt he had no choice. A man couldn't let himself be stolen from, couldn't let himself be disrespected. Not in a place like Blackridge where your reputation was all you had. But now, lying in a cold cell with his family's future hanging by a thread, he wondered if he'd been wrong. If maybe there had been another way. The trial began on a Monday morning in January 1953. The courthouse in Welch was packed with spectators, miners from Blackridge and other camps, reporters from newspapers in Charleston, and even as far away as Pittsburgh, curiosity seekers attracted by the lurid details of the case. Rosa Corelli sat in the front row, dressed in black, her face a mask of grief and fury. Mary sat on the opposite side with Tommy Brennan and several other supporters, holding herself rigid with determination. Judge Samuel Morrison presided, a stern man in his 60s with a reputation for strict adherence to the letter of the law. The prosecutor, William Dodson, was exactly what Foster had described, young, ambitious, impeccably dressed, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from never having worked a day in the mines, never having felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on you in the darkness. The jury was selected quickly. 12 men, all local, all aware of the case. Several admitted to having opinions about Jake's guilt or innocence, but promised they could be impartial. Foster had no choice but to accept them. In a county as small as McDowell, everyone knew everyone else's business. Dodson's opening statement was devastating. He painted Jake as a violent man who'd committed a brutal murder over a trivial dispute, who'd struck down an unarmed man in front of dozens of witnesses, who'd shown no remorse. He described in graphic detail how the pickaxe had torn into Corelli's neck, how he'd swung multiple times, how the victim had tried to defend himself but was overwhelmed by Jake's ferocity. This was not self-defense, Dodson said, his voice ringing through the courtroom. This was not a heat of passion killing. This was cold-blooded murder, premeditated and brutal. Jacob Thornton decided that Vincent Corelli deserved to die, and he carried out that execution in front of 75 witnesses. The law is clear, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. When you take another man's life in such a manner, you must face the consequences, and in this case those consequences must be severe. Foster's opening was more subdued. He acknowledged that Jake had killed Corelli, but asked the jury to consider the context. He talked about the harsh life in the mining camps, about how a man's tools were his livelihood, about the code of honor that governed relationships between miners. He promised to show that Jake had been provoked, that Corelli had stolen from him, and then attacked him when confronted. "My client made a terrible mistake," Foster said. "In a moment of rage and fear, he struck out at a man who was threatening him, who had stolen from him, who was larger and stronger and had a history of violence. Was it the right thing to do? No. Should he have walked away? Yes. But in that moment, in the heat of confrontation, Jake Thornton reacted the way many men would react when pushed beyond their limits. This is not first-degree murder. This is, at most, manslaughter, a killing that occurred in the heat of passion without premeditation. And given the circumstances, given the provocation, it's a killing that deserves understanding and mercy, not the death penalty. The prosecution's case unfolded over the next 3 days. Witness after witness testified about what they'd seen: Jake swinging the pickaxe, Corelli falling, the blood in the mud. Russell Hewitt, the foreman, testified that there had been no indication Jake was in danger when he struck, that Corelli had been grappling with Tommy Brennan, not Jake, at the moment of the attack. Several of Corelli's friends testified that the pickaxe had been legitimately purchased, that Jake had made false accusations and attacked an innocent man. The medical examiner testified about the nature of Corelli's wounds, multiple blows, any one of which could have been fatal, delivered with tremendous force. The implication was clear. This wasn't defensive action. This was rage-fueled violence. Foster cross-examined aggressively but couldn't shake the core facts. Yes, Jake had killed Corelli. Yes, it had been brutal. Yes, there had been witnesses. The question wasn't what happened. Everyone agreed on that. But why it happened and whether Jake should be held fully accountable. When the prosecution rested, Foster began presenting his defense. He called miners who testified about Corelli's history of violence and intimidation. He called Pete McAllister, the retired miner who swore he'd never owned that particular pickaxe, had never sold it to Corelli. He called Tommy Brennan, who described how Corelli had been choking him, how Jake had come to his rescue. And then Foster called Jake to the stand. Jake looked older than his 32 years as he took his seat in the witness box. The weeks in jail had taken their toll. He'd lost weight. His face was gaunt, his eyes haunted. But when he spoke, his voice was steady and clear. Foster led him through his history, growing up in the mountains, learning to mine from his father, inheriting the pickaxe when the old man died. Jake explained how the tool wasn't just equipment, but a connection to his father, a symbol of his family's legacy in the coal fields. "When I discovered it was stolen," Jake said, "it felt like someone had stolen part of my father, part of my history." He described confronting Corelli, the argument that ensued, the fight that broke out. "I didn't go there planning to kill anyone," Jake said. "I just wanted my property back. But when I saw him with that pickaxe, when he refused to show me the handle, when he threatened me, something broke inside. I'd had enough. Of the stealing, of the disrespect, of always having to back down to bigger, stronger men who thought they could take whatever they wanted." "And when you hit him with the pickaxe," Foster asked, "what were you thinking?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. "I wasn't thinking, I was just reacting. He'd been choking Tommy and I grabbed the pickaxe and I swung, and then I kept swinging because I couldn't stop. It was like all the anger and frustration of 15 years working in those mines just came pouring out. Every time the company shorted our pay, every time someone got hurt because they wouldn't buy proper equipment, every time we had to bow and scrape to men who saw us as less than human, all of it came out in that moment." Dodson's cross-examination was withering. He forced Jake to admit he'd struck first, that Corelli had been grappling with someone else when Jake attacked, that he'd continued hitting even after Corelli was down and clearly mortally wounded. "You say you weren't thinking," Dodson said, "but you had time to think when you picked up that pickaxe. You had time to think as you crossed the yard toward Vincent Corelli. You had time to think as you drew it back for that first swing. Isn't it true, Mr. Thornton, that you knew exactly what you were doing? That you intended to kill Vincent Corelli to punish him for what you perceived as disrespect?" Jake stared at the prosecutor for a long moment. The courtroom was absolutely silent, everyone waiting for his answer. Finally he spoke. "Yes," Jake said quietly. In that moment, I wanted him dead. I wanted him to pay for what he'd done, and I'm going to have to live with that for the rest of my life. The admission seemed to suck the air out of the defense. Foster tried to recover in redirect examination, emphasizing the provocation, the heat of passion, but the damage was done. Jake had essentially confessed to intentional killing. Closing arguments were scheduled for the next morning. That night, Foster met with Jake in the jail. Why did you say that? Foster demanded. Why did you admit to intentional killing? I could have argued heat of passion, could have suggested you acted without conscious thought. But now? Because it's the truth, Jake interrupted. I've done a lot of things wrong in my life, but I've never been a liar. I killed Corelli intentionally. Maybe it was wrong. Maybe I should have walked away, but in that moment, I made a choice. And I'm not going to stand up in court and pretend I didn't. Foster sat back, exhausted. You understand what this means? The jury will almost certainly convict on first-degree murder. The judge will have no choice but to sentence you to death or life in prison. I understand, Jake said. But at least I'll go knowing I told the truth. The next morning, Dodson's closing argument hammered home the theme of premeditated murder. He described Jake's admission, his acknowledgement that he'd intended to kill Corelli. The defendant has confessed, Dodson said. He has admitted that in that moment he wanted Vincent Corelli dead. That is the legal definition of first-degree murder. Your duty as jurors is clear. You must convict and you must send a message that violence will not be tolerated in our communities. Foster's closing was passionate, but ultimately futile. He appealed to the jury's understanding of mining life, of the pressures and tensions that could drive a good man to do terrible things. He reminded them of Corelli's history of violence, of the theft of the pickaxe, of all the mitigating factors. But he couldn't escape the central fact. Jake had intentionally killed another man. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, their faces were grim. We find the defendant, Jacob Thornton, guilty of murder in the first degree. Mary let out a sob from the gallery. Jake stood motionless, his face expressionless. He'd expected this verdict, had known it was coming, but hearing the words still hit like a physical blow. Judge Morrison set sentencing for 1 week later, giving Foster time to prepare mitigating evidence. But everyone knew what the sentence would be. West Virginia had the death penalty, and first-degree murder typically carried either death or life without parole. The week between conviction and sentencing passed in a blur. Mary brought the children to visit Jake for what might be the last time. Sarah, 9 years old, didn't fully understand what was happening, but knew it was bad. Thomas cried. Little Margaret just wanted to sit on her father's lap and refused to let go when visiting time ended. I love you, Jake told them. No matter what happens, no matter what anyone tells you about me, remember that I love you. And everything I did because I thought it was right. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was never wrong about how much I love you three. The sentencing hearing was anticlimactic. Foster presented character witnesses, minors who testified to Jake's good character, to his help over the years, to his role as a husband and father. But Judge Morrison listened with a stony face. When it came time to pronounce sentence, Morrison looked directly at Jake. Mr. Thornton, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of murder in the first degree. You took the life of another human being in a brutal and violent manner. While I understand that there was provocation, that Vincent Corelli was not himself a model citizen, the law is clear. We cannot allow people to take justice into their own hands, to kill those who wrong them. That way lies chaos. However, I have considered the testimony regarding your character, your lack of prior criminal history, and the circumstances that led to this tragedy. Therefore, I am sentencing you to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. You will be transported to the state penitentiary at Moundsville to serve your sentence. May God have mercy on your soul. 25 years. Jake would be 57 before he was even eligible for parole. His children would be grown. Mary would be in her 50s. The life he'd known was over. As the deputies led him away, Jake looked back one last time at Mary. She was crying, but she held his gaze, and in her eyes he saw something that surprised him. Not condemnation, but sorrow and love and a fierce determination. She would survive. She would raise their children. She would endure. The story should have ended there. Jake Thornton going to prison, serving his time, maybe eventually being paroled decades down the line. That would have been tragedy enough. But what happened next transformed the story from a simple tale of violence and consequences into something far darker, something that would haunt Blackridge and McDowell County for generations. Jake was transported to Moundsville Penitentiary 3 days after sentencing. The prison was a Gothic monstrosity built in the 1870s, with thick stone walls and tiny cells that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. Jake was processed, given a number, 45891, and assigned to a cell in the south wing. Prison life was brutal. The guards were corrupt, the inmates were violent, and every day was a battle for survival. But Jake adapted. He'd spent 15 years working underground in conditions that would have broken most men. The prison was just another kind of mine, another dark place where you kept your head down and did your work and tried not to think about the world outside. He received letters from Mary regularly. She'd found work as a seamstress doing alterations and making dresses for wealthier families in Welch. The children were in school doing well despite the stigma of being the murderer's kids. Tommy Brennan and some of the other miners sent money when they could, helping Mary make ends meet. But 6 months into Jake's sentence, the letters stopped. At first, Jake wasn't worried. Mail was unreliable, letters got lost. But when a week passed, then 2, then 3, with no word from Mary, he began to fear the worst. He wrote to Tommy Brennan asking what had happened. The reply that came back was devastating. Mary had been found dead in their house in Blackridge. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but Tommy's letter hinted at something darker. There were bruises on her body, signs of a struggle, and several of Vincent Corelli's friends had been seen near the house in the days before her death. Jake's grief transformed into something cold and dark. He'd taken everything from Corelli, his life, his future, and now Corelli's friends had taken Mary from him. In prison, with nothing but time to think, Jake's mind turned to revenge. He began writing letters to people he'd known in Blackridge, asking questions, gathering information. He learned that Rosa Corelli had remarried and moved to Pennsylvania. He learned that 3 of Vincent's closest friends, Antonio Russo, Carlo Benedetti, and Frank Dominguez, were still working at the mine. And he learned, through careful questioning and piecing together of rumors, that those 3 men had confronted Mary several times after Jake's conviction, demanding compensation for Vincent's death, threatening her. Tommy Brennan's next letter confirmed what Jake had suspected. "They killed her, Jake. Everyone knows it, but the sheriff won't do anything. Clayton says there's no evidence, and even if there was, the coal company doesn't want more trouble. They want this whole thing forgotten." Jake made a decision that day. He would escape Moundsville, return to Blackridge, and finish what he'd started. If the law wouldn't provide justice for Mary, he would provide it himself. Planning an escape from Moundsville was nearly impossible. The prison had been built specifically to be escape-proof, with its thick walls and multiple security layers. But Jake had something most prisoners didn't: patience and knowledge of working underground. He'd spent years in tight spaces, moving through darkness, understanding the properties of stone and earth. He began to study the prison's layout, paying attention to where the walls were weakest, where water had caused deterioration over the decades. He made friends with an older inmate named Henry Walsh, who'd worked construction before his conviction for robbery. Together they identified a spot in the basement where the foundation was crumbling, where determined men with time and proper tools might be able to dig through. The problem was tools. Everything in the prison was accounted for, monitored, checked regularly. But Jake was resourceful. He stole a spoon from the kitchen and spent weeks sharpening it on the stone floor of his cell until it could scrape mortar from between bricks. He fashioned a crude chisel from a piece of metal pipe broken off a bunk bed. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. For 18 months, Jake worked on the tunnel. Every day during his assigned work detail in the laundry, located in the basement where he had access to the weak section of wall, he would chip away at the foundation, hiding the debris in bags that he'd carry out with the trash. Henry Walsh helped, keeping watch and creating distractions when guards came too close. It was slow, agonizing work. Some weeks they'd make only an inch of progress. But Jake was driven by a singular purpose. Get out, get to Blackridge, make Russo, Benedetti and Dominguez pay for Mary's death. On a rainy night in October 1954, Jake finally broke through. The tunnel wasn't large, barely big enough to crawl through, but it opened into a storm drain that ran outside the prison walls. Jake and Henry had planned to escape together, but at the last moment, Henry backed out. "I'm too old here," the older man said. "I'd just slow you down, but you go, you do what needs doing, and Jake, don't come back. Whatever you do out there, make it count, because you won't get another chance." Jake crawled through the tunnel, through the storm drain, and emerged into the October rain half a mile from the prison. He was free. He made his way to Blackridge on foot, traveling at night and hiding during the day. It took him 5 days to cover the 100 miles, living on food stolen from farms and sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings. By the time he reached McDowell County, he looked like a ghost, gaunt, filthy, with wild eyes and a scraggly beard. He arrived in Blackridge on a Sunday night. The camp was quiet, most of the miners either sleeping or drinking at Murphy's Tavern. Jake made his way to the house where he'd lived with Mary and the children. It was empty now, boarded up. The sight of it, dark windows like dead eyes, weeds growing in the yard, filled him with a rage so intense it made his hands shake. He'd prepared for this moment during his months of planning. He knew where Russo, Benedetti, and Dominguez lived. He knew their routines, knew when they'd be vulnerable, and he knew with absolute certainty that before the sun rose, they would be dead. Jake's first stop was a storage shed behind the mine office where tools were kept. He broke in easily. The lock was cheap, and after 18 months of prison life, simple breaking and entering was nothing. Inside, he found what he was looking for, a pickaxe. Not his father's, that was evidence locked away somewhere, but one that would serve the same purpose. Antonio Russo lived alone in a small house on the edge of the camp. He was a bachelor, a man in his 40s who'd come to America from Sicily and never quite fit in anywhere. Jake approached the house quietly, moving through shadows, avoiding the few streetlights that had been installed along the main road. Russo's door wasn't locked. Jake slipped inside and found the man asleep in his bed, snoring softly. For a moment, Jake stood there, pickaxe in hand, looking at the sleeping figure. This man had helped kill Mary. This man had threatened her, had probably been there when she died, had helped cover it up. Jake raised the pickaxe and brought it down. Russo woke at the last second, saw the figure looming over him, opened his mouth to scream. But the pickaxe caught him in the chest, driving deep, cutting off the scream before it could form. Jake struck again, and again, until Russo stopped moving. The killing was eerily similar to what had happened with Vincent Corelli. Sudden, brutal, decisive. But this time, there were no witnesses, no crowd of miners watching, just Jake and his victim and the darkness. Carlo Benedetti was next. He lived with his brother Marco in a house near the center of camp. Jake approached more carefully this time, knowing that 2 men would be harder to handle than 1. He watched the house for an hour, waiting for the right moment. It came when Marco left to use the outhouse behind the building. Jake slipped inside and found Carlo in the kitchen, having a late-night drink. The man looked up as Jake entered, confusion giving way to recognition, and then fear. "Thornton, but you're in—" Jake didn't let him finish. He swung the pickaxe and Carlo went down. Marco, hearing the commotion, came running back from the outhouse. He burst through the door to find his brother on the floor and Jake standing over him, pickaxe dripping blood. Marco tried to run. Jake caught him before he made it to the front door, bringing him down with a swing that caught him in the back. Marco fell, screaming, trying to crawl away. Jake finished him with another blow. 2 men who'd had nothing to do with Mary's death. Marco had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Jake was beyond caring about collateral damage. He was a force of nature now, driven by grief and rage. Frank Dominguez was the last of the 3. He lived with his wife, Elena, and their 2 children in a house at the far end of camp. Jake knew this would be the most difficult. Killing a man in front of his family went against everything Jake believed in. His own children had already lost their mother. Did he really want to inflict that same pain on Dominguez's kids? But as he approached the house, He thought about Sarah and Thomas and little Margaret, orphaned now, living with Mary's sister in Charleston. He thought about the life they should have had, the future that had been stolen from them, and his resolve hardened. The house was dark, except for a light in the bedroom. Jake crept up to the window and looked inside. Dominguez was reading in bed while Elena slept beside him. The sight was almost domestic, peaceful, the kind of scene Jake had experienced countless times with Mary. He went around to the back door and tried the handle, locked. He used the pickaxe to break the lock, not caring about the noise anymore. Let them hear him coming. Let them know death was at the door. Dominguez heard the breaking wood and came running, a pistol in his hand. He fired as Jake came through the door, but the shot went wild, punching a hole in the wall. Jake rushed him, knocking him down before he could fire again. They grappled, the gun skittering across the floor. Elena was screaming, the children crying in their room. Dominguez fought desperately, knowing his life depended on it. He was younger than Jake, stronger, and he managed to get on top, his hands around Jake's throat, squeezing. Jake's vision started to blur, darkness creeping in at the edges. He fumbled for the pickaxe, fingers closing around the handle. With the last of his strength, he brought it up and slammed the pointed end into Dominguez's side. The man's grip loosened. Jake struck again, and Dominguez rolled off him, gasping, blood spreading across his shirt. Elena ran into the room, saw her husband dying on the floor, saw Jake getting to his feet with the bloody pickaxe. "Please," she begged. "Please don't. The children—" Jake looked at her, at the terror in her eyes, and for a moment, something human flickered in his gaze. Then he looked down at Dominguez, who was trying to crawl toward the gun. "This is for Mary," Jake said, and brought the pickaxe down one final time. Elena's screams brought neighbors running. By the time Jake staggered out of the house, a crowd was forming. He stood in the yard, covered in blood, the pickaxe still in his hands, looking like something out of a nightmare. Tommy Brennan was there, his face pale with horror. "Jesus Christ, Jake, what have you done?" "What I had to do," Jake said. His voice was calm, almost peaceful. "They killed Mary. Now we're even." "You killed 5 men tonight," Tommy said. "Russo, Carlo and Marco Dominguez and—" Jake. Marco wasn't involved. He had nothing to do with Mary's death. Jake looked down at the pickaxe, seeing it clearly for the first time. Blood dripped from the steel head, forming small puddles in the mud. 5 men. He'd killed 5 men in a single night, and one of them had been innocent. The realization hit him like a physical blow. What had he become? He'd started this journey trying to defend his honor, to get back what was stolen from him. But somewhere along the way he'd transformed into something monstrous, something that killed without discrimination, that left children orphaned and women widowed. Sheriff Clayton arrived with his deputies, guns drawn. "Drop the pickaxe, Jake, it's over." Jake looked at the sheriff, at the crowd of miners surrounding him, at the house behind him where Elena Dominguez was sobbing over her husband's body. It was over. He'd taken his revenge, had killed the men responsible for Mary's death, and one who wasn't. But the satisfaction he'd expected, the sense of justice fulfilled, never came. He just felt empty. He dropped the pickaxe and held out his hands for the handcuffs. The news of the massacre spread like wildfire through McDowell County and beyond. The newspapers had a field day. "Escaped convict kills 5 in bloody rampage," screamed the headlines. "The pickaxe killer strikes again," declared another. Reporters descended on Blackridge, interviewing anyone who would talk, taking photographs of the crime scenes, turning Jake Thornton into a monster for the entertainment of readers across the country. But in Blackridge itself, the reaction was more complicated. Yes, Jake had killed 5 men in cold blood. Yes, he'd broken out of prison and gone on a killing spree. But many of the miners understood, at least partially, what had driven him to it. They'd known Mary, had seen how Russo, Benedetti, and Dominguez had harassed her after Jake's conviction. They'd suspected foul play in her death, even if they couldn't prove it. The problem was Marco Benedetti. He'd been an innocent man, just 23 years old, killed simply because he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. His death changed the narrative. Jake wasn't just a man seeking justice anymore. He was a killer who didn't discriminate between guilty and innocent. This time, there would be no trial. Jake waived his right to one, pleading guilty to all 5 murders. At the sentencing hearing, Judge Morrison, the same judge who'd sentenced him before, looked at him with something like pity. "Mr. Thornton, when I sentenced you the first time, I hoped that prison would give you time to reflect, to come to terms with what you'd done, to perhaps find some measure of peace. Instead, you've proven yourself to be beyond redemption. You escaped from prison, returned to this community, and slaughtered 5 men. One of them wasn't even involved in the events you claim drove you to violence." Jake stood silently, his face showing no emotion. What was there to say? Morrison was right, he was beyond redemption. "I hereby sentence you to death by electrocution," Morrison continued. "You will be returned to Moundsville Penitentiary and held in death row until such time as your sentence is carried out. And may God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none to offer." The execution was scheduled for June 1955, giving Jake's lawyers time to file appeals, but Jake instructed them not to. He didn't want appeals, didn't want delays. He was ready to face whatever came next. He spent his final months on death row in a small cell with a barred window that looked out on nothing but grey sky. Other inmates on death row were there for various crimes: robbery gone wrong, domestic murders, one man who'd killed a police officer. But none had Jake's story. None carried the weight of so much loss and violence. A priest named Father Michael O'Brien visited him regularly, trying to prepare him for death, to help him find peace with God. Jake appreciated the effort, but couldn't bring himself to believe. If there was a God, he'd abandoned these mountains long ago, left the miners to the mercy of the coal companies and their own desperate choices. "What about your children?" Father O'Brien asked during one visit. "Don't you want to see them before—" "No," Jake said firmly. "I don't want them to remember me like this. Let them remember the father I was before all this started. Let them remember the man who took them fishing on Sundays and read them stories at night. Not this." He gestured at himself, at the cell, at everything he'd become. But Sarah, now 11 years old, came anyway. Mary's sister brought her against Jake's wishes, because Sarah had insisted. She needed to see her father one last time. The visit broke Jake in a way nothing else had. Sarah sat across from him in the visiting room, separated by a wire mesh screen, and her eyes held a mixture of love and confusion that pierced through all his defenses. "Why did you do it, Daddy?" she asked. "Why did you kill those men?" Jake wanted to explain about honor, about revenge, about justice, but looking at his daughter's face, he realized how hollow those words were. "I was angry," he said finally, "and I thought violence was the answer. But I was wrong, Sarah. I was wrong about everything, and now I'm paying the price." "I still love you," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "Even though everyone says you're a monster, I still love you." "I love you too, sweetheart," Jake said, his own tears finally coming. "And I'm so sorry for everything." That was the last time he saw any of his children. Thomas and Margaret never came. They were too young to understand, or perhaps Mary's sister thought it would be too traumatic. Jake was grateful for that small mercy. The days counted down to his execution. Jake spent them thinking about his life, about the choices he'd made, about the moment the pickaxe was stolen, and everything began to spiral out of control. Could he have handled it differently? Obviously, yes. Should he have just let it go, gotten a new pickaxe, moved on? Yes. But in that moment, with Corelli's mocking face and the jeers of the other miners, it had seemed impossible. One thing he thought about constantly was the number. 10 men. The newspapers called him the Pickaxe Killer who murdered 10. But that wasn't quite accurate. He'd killed Vincent Corelli, Antonio Russo, Carlo and Marco Benedetti, and Frank Dominguez. 5 men. Where did the number 10 come from? The answer, he eventually learned from a guard who liked to read the papers aloud, was that the press had decided to count differently. They counted Vincent Corelli. They counted the 5 from his rampage. They counted Rosa Corelli's stillborn baby, reasoning that Jake's actions had caused its death. They counted Mary, even though Jake hadn't killed her. The narrative was that his initial violence had set in motion the events that led to her death. They counted Henry Walsh, who'd been beaten to death by guards at Moundsville when the tunnel was discovered. And they counted Jake himself, since he was about to be executed. 10 deaths, all traceable back to a stolen pickaxe and one man's inability to let go of a slight. The night before his execution, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, watching the shadows shift as guards walked past with their flashlights. He thought about his father, wondered what the old man would think of how his pickaxe's legacy had ended. Edward Thornton had been a simple man, a hard worker who believed in doing right by your family and your fellow miners. He'd never been violent, never lost his temper the way Jake had. If he could see what his son had become, he'd be ashamed. At dawn, Father O'Brien came for final rites. Jake went through the motions, reciting the prayers, accepting the communion, but feeling nothing. His soul, if he'd ever had one, had been burned away in the fires of rage and revenge. They came for him at 8 a.m. The walk to the execution chamber seemed to take both forever and no time at all. Jake's legs felt disconnected from his body, moving on their own while his mind floated somewhere above, observing everything with detachment. The electric chair sat in the center of a small room, a grotesque throne of wood and metal and leather straps. Witnesses filled the gallery, reporters, officials, and in the front row, Elena Dominguez wearing black, her eyes red from crying, but her jaw set with determination. She wanted to watch the man who'd killed her husband die. They strapped Jake into the chair, fastened the leather restraints around his wrists and ankles, placed the metal cap on his head. The warden asked if he had any last words. Jake looked at the assembled witnesses, at Elena Dominguez's tear-stained face, at the reporters with their notebooks, ready to record his final statement for posterity. He thought about everything he wanted to say, about the coal companies that created the conditions for violence, about the system that valued coal over human lives, about the cycle of revenge that had destroyed so many families, including his own. But in the end, he said only 3 words. "I'm sorry, Mary." The warden signaled the executioner. The first jolt of electricity hit Jake's body, making it rigid, his hands clenching into fists. The smell of burning flesh filled the room. After 30 seconds, they checked. He was still alive. They hit him again, longer this time, and when they checked the second time, Jake Thornton was dead. He was 34 years old. The aftermath of Jake Thornton's execution rippled through McDowell County for years. The story became legend, a cautionary tale told in mining camps across Appalachia about what happens when pride and violence spiral out of control. The Pickaxe Killer entered the regional folklore, his name spoken in hushed tones, his crimes exaggerated with each retelling, until fact and fiction blurred together. Blackridge itself never fully recovered. The mine continued to operate, but the sense of community that had once existed, fragile as it was, had been shattered. Too many men had died, too many families had been destroyed. Within 5 years, the Consolidated Coal Company closed the Blackridge operation. The coal seam exhausted, and the camp was gradually abandoned. By 1960, it was a ghost town, the Grey Company houses slowly collapsing back into the earth, reclaimed by the mountains. Jake's children were raised by Mary's sister in Charleston. Sarah eventually became a teacher, dedicating her life to education as a way to help children avoid the cycle of violence and poverty that had destroyed her family. She never married, never spoke publicly about her father, carrying the weight of his crimes in silence until her death in 1998. Thomas joined the army and served in Vietnam, seeking perhaps to find meaning in sanctioned violence, in fighting for a cause rather than personal revenge. He came home with his own demons, struggled with alcoholism, and died in a car accident in 1972 at the age of 27. Margaret, too young to remember much of her father, had the easiest time of the 3. She married a banker, moved to Ohio, raised 4 children of her own, and lived to see her grandchildren grow up. She rarely thought about the events in Blackridge, preferred not to, and when asked about her family history, she'd say simply that her father had died when she was young. The pickaxe, Jake's father's pickaxe that had started it all, remained in evidence storage for decades. Eventually, it was transferred to a historical society in Charleston, where it became part of an exhibit about mining life in West Virginia. Tourists would walk past it, seeing just another tool, not understanding the bloody history it represented, the lives it had ended, the families it had destroyed. In the years that followed, historians and sociologists studied the case, trying to understand what had driven Jake Thornton to such extreme violence. Some blamed the harsh conditions of mining life, the constant danger and economic precarity that created a powder keg of tension, always ready to explode. Others pointed to a culture of masculine honor that couldn't tolerate perceived slights, that equated backing down with weakness. Some saw it as a critique of the coal companies, which created communities where men were so desperate, so ground down by poverty and exploitation, that something as simple as a stolen tool could trigger a massacre. The companies paid minimal wages, charged inflated prices at company stores, evicted families from company housing for the smallest infractions, and cultivated an environment where miners saw each other as competitors rather than allies. But perhaps the simplest explanation was also the truest. Jake Thornton was a man who made a series of terrible choices, each one leading inexorably to the next, each one closing off the possibility of turning back. When Vincent Corelli stole his pickaxe, Jake could have reported it and moved on. When Corelli challenged him, Jake could have walked away. When the fight broke out, Jake could have let others handle it. When Mary died, Jake could have grieved and focused on his remaining children rather than seeking revenge. But he didn't. At each decision point, he chose violence, chose pride, chose revenge. And each choice made the next one easier, until he'd traveled so far down that dark path that there was no way back. The town of Welch still stands, though it's a shadow of what it was during the coal boom. McDowell County, once one of the wealthiest in West Virginia, is now one of the poorest in the nation. The mines are mostly closed, the jobs gone, the young people moved away seeking opportunities elsewhere. But old-timers still tell stories about the mining days, about the dangers and hardships, about the characters who populated the camps. And sometimes late at night in the few bars that remain open, someone will mention Jake Thornton. The details are fuzzy now, the timeline confused, the number of victims varying depending on who's telling the story. Some say he killed 10 men, some say 20, some say he went on a rampage that lasted for weeks before they finally caught him. But the core of the story remains. A miner's pickaxe was stolen, and what followed was a bloodbath that destroyed families and haunted a community for generations. It's a story about pride and violence, about the terrible cost of revenge, about how one man's inability to let go of a slight created a cascade of tragedy that touched dozens of lives. On the hillside above where Blackridge once stood, there's a small cemetery. Mary Thornton is buried there, her grave marked with a simple stone that reads, "Beloved Wife and Mother, 1920-1953. Nearby are the graves of Vincent Corelli, Antonio Russo, and the Benedetti brothers. Frank Dominguez is buried in a Catholic cemetery in Welch, his grave visited regularly by Elena until her own death in 1989. Jake himself is buried in the prison cemetery at Moundsville, in an unmarked grave alongside other executed inmates. No memorial, no stone, nothing to indicate that Jake Thornton ever existed, except for the dusty court records and fading newspaper clippings stored in archives that few people ever visit. The mountains of West Virginia remain, ancient and indifferent, having witnessed countless human dramas play out in their hollows and on their slopes. The coal still lies deep underground, though most of it will never be mined now, the industry that brought so much wealth and misery to these hills slowly dying. The camps where men like Jake Thornton once lived and worked have mostly disappeared, reclaimed by forest and time, but the story endures, a dark chapter in the history of Appalachia, a reminder of what happens when pride and violence collide with desperation and injustice. It's a story with no heroes, only victims and perpetrators who are often the same people. It's a story about the cost of honor, the price of revenge, and the terrible truth that violence, once unleashed, feeds on itself until everything is consumed. The West Virginia bloodbath, as it came to be known, left 10 people dead and countless others scarred. It destroyed families, shattered a community, and created ripples that extended far beyond the mountains where it occurred. And it all started with something as simple as a stolen pickaxe and one man's inability to let it go. In the end, Jake Thornton's legacy is a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting anger and pride override reason and compassion. His story reminds us that revenge is never as satisfying as we imagine it will be, that violence begets more violence, and that the true measure of strength is not in how hard you can hit but in knowing when to walk away. The pickaxe that Edward Thornton passed to his son, meant to be a tool for feeding a family and building a life, instead became an instrument of death that destroyed everything it touched. Sometimes an object is just an object, but sometimes, in the hands of a desperate man pushed beyond his limits, it becomes a symbol of everything that can go wrong when human beings forget their humanity.